Scott Ritter, former United Nations weapons inspector. Welcome to the Young Turks.
Well, thanks for having me.
We really appreciate you coming on. Scott, every time there's a conversation where Republicans say, well, everybody thought that Saddam had weapons of mass destruction before the war, the name that always comes up is, no, Scott Ritter didn't. So how come you knew what they didn't know? Or they claimed they didn't know?
Well, actually, that's a curious. First of all, they have no excuse. The senior decision makers cannot claim that they knew anything. In fact, if you go back and review the words of Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice in 2001, prior to the events of September 11th, they said that Saddam Hussein had been fundamentally disarmed and that he was contained and that he did not pose a threat to the United States of America. It was only after September 11th, 2001, when the Bush administration reevaluated everything within this new context of a global war on terror, that suddenly Saddam became a threat. As a weapons inspector, as a chief weapons inspector in Iraq from 91 to 98, I was at the center of the effort to disarm Iraq. And while much of our work wasn't known to the average American or the average citizen around the world, we were absolutely transparent when it came to letting the Security Council nations, letting the United Nations, governments know what we were doing. And I think it was common knowledge that we had fundamentally disarmed Iraq. Not completely, but no one was disputing the fact that we could account for 95 to 98% of their weapons of mass destruction, and that the unaccounted for material was pretty much moot, given the fact that we had in place the most intrusive, technologically advanced on-site inspection program in the history of arms control. And so it's not that I knew something they didn't know, it's that I insisted on adhering to the facts in the aftermath of September 11th, when others allowed ideology and ambition to lead them astray.
So I got a lot of questions about how you knew things and how things got twisted around. As a weapons inspector in Iraq, how did it work? I mean, how do you know, you said up to 98% certainty, that they didn't have the weapons somewhere else? I mean, how could you know that throughout the country that you were hitting all the right places?
Well, first of all, you can't hide what you haven't produced. We start from that fundamental understanding. And so one of our goals is to establish what we call a material balance. That is to define what it is we're looking for. And we do that a number of ways. First off, the Iraqis were obligated to provide, a full and complete disclosure of all their weapons of mass destruction. And, when the inspection regime first started, the Iraqis instead chose to lie. They submitted a declaration. They did submit a considerable amount of material for us to dispose of, but they lied about other aspects. For instance, they failed to declare any aspect of their nuclear weapons program, denying they had one, and they did the same with their biological weapons program. They underdeclared their ballistic missile program, and they underdeclared their chemical weapons program. And so right off the bat, we were in a difficult situation where we now have to seek the truth. You do so by not only going into Iraq and seeking out ground truth in Iraq, but you also, remember, weapons of mass destruction don't appear out of a top hat like a white rabbit at a magic show. You just don't snap your fingers and voila, they're there. They're a product of science and technology, and it's known science and known technology. In order for the Iraqis to have a chemical weapon, there are certain processes and certain technologies and materials that they have to gain access to. And so you start tracking these down around the world. And, for every month I spent in Iraq as a weapons inspector, I spent 4 to 6 months outside of Iraq doing intelligence preparation, going to Germany, going to England, going to France, going to other nations, doing the sleuth work, the investigative work, the detective work to see what had been exported to Iraq, what Iraq had brought in. And then armed with this information, we go to Iraq and we confront the Iraqis with factual-based, starting points, and we either get the Iraqis to agree or we get the Iraqis to lie. And if they lie, we now have a framework to investigate further. This was hard forensic investigation. People, I think, are familiar with these shows, CSI, Crime Scene Investigation, Las Vegas, Miami, New York, and they see these guys on TV doing this forensic work. Well, we were CSI Baghdad. We weren't as good looking as the people on TV, but we were 100 times better than they could ever be because we were the real deal. We were the best forensic investigators the world has ever seen, and that's why when I say 95 to 98% certainty, that's what I know. Our job isn't to hunt for, search every square inch of the soil in Baghdad looking for a negative. Our job was to ascertain what the material balance was, and then once we know what Iraq had produced, we then go to account for it. And that's why we had certainty. And again, I stand by our analysis. What we said we had found turned out to be absolutely the case. We were the best source of intelligence information on Iraq, better than any other nation in the world.
Yeah, Scott, you were pretty roundly demonized by pundits, the press, and politicians in the run-up to the war in 2003. Has a single one of them ever found you and apologized to you?
No politician has. Politicians are loath to issue apologies. It's not about doing the right thing. It's about doing what the politically expedient thing is. There have been a number of pundits and journalists who have tried to set the record straight. Wolf Blitzer, for one, had me on his program in CNN and pretty much acknowledged that I had been right when everybody else had been wrong, and then he was chastised by his own network for making that apology. No news network wants to admit that they're wrong. One of the big problems that news networks have today is that every interview that I ever did with them prior to the war is available online as a transcript, and I'm very proud of those transcripts because they establish a record that makes it clear that I was telling the truth. I didn't have any political axes to grind leading up to the war. I wasn't there pushing an ideological agenda. I was pushing the truth. And as somebody who spent 12 years in the United States Marine Corps and has gone to war for my country, I operate under the premise that we don't go to war based on lies and falsehoods, that war is the absolute last option, and we must exhaust all options before sending our troops to war. And if you as president or Congress are saying that we are confronting Iraq because Iraq is armed to the teeth with weapons of mass destruction, and I'm in a position to say, well, wait a minute, that's really not the case, it is my patriotic duty to speak out. I'm always confused when people say it's unpatriotic to speak out against a president in a time of war. I always believed it was responsibility of the citizen to hold their elected representatives accountable, especially when it can be demonstrated that our elected representatives are wrong. Then we have a moral obligation to speak out. It's the most patriotic thing you can do. But I don't want apologies from people. What I want is a society to learn from its mistakes. And sadly, I don't think we are. One only needs to take a look at how Iran is being demonized today and how the same case is being made against Iran. The same patterns of behavior are being repeated that we had conducted against Iraq. And once again, any American who dares raise their hand and ask questions about Iranian policy are accused of being unpatriotic. We haven't learned a darn thing, and unfortunately, it's the American soldier, sailor, airman, and Marine who pay the price.
We're talking to Scott Ritter, former United Nations weapons inspector from 1991 to 1998 in Iraq. Scott, I want to go back to the timeline real quick. What happened after 98, and how can you be assured that they did not regain those weapons of mass destruction between 98 and 03?
When I left in 98, we had a certain benchmark of activity. We had in place, we not only had the results of our disarmament effort, which again led us to believe that we could account for 95 to 98% of their weaponry, we had in place this extensive monitoring regime. Now the inspectors left, and a lot of people make the argument that with the inspectors gone, the Iraqis could have reconstituted, and I'm not disputing that. That's why I spent a lot of time trying to get weapons inspectors reinserted into Iraq so that we would have certainty, not speculation. That's why I went to Baghdad in 2002 and spoke before their parliament and met with their senior leadership to implore them to let inspectors return. And I'm very proud to say that 5 days after I finished that trip, Saddam Hussein reversed his decision and said that inspectors would be allowed to return and without restriction. And inspectors did go back to Iraq in 2002 and were there up until right before the war. And the interesting thing is while they were there, they found nothing. the U.S. government had come out in October of 2002 and said that there were 25 facilities in Iraq that U.S. intelligence had identified with absolute certainty as being currently involved in WMD programs. Well, the inspectors got back in, went to all those facilities and more, and said there's nothing going on here. Not only is there nothing going on now, nothing has been going on for years. And this points out something that I've been saying. Again, you can't make these weapons in a cave in the middle of nowhere. They're a product of modern science and technology. And while we didn't have weapons inspectors on the ground, there were things that Iraq would have to do that are eminently detectable if they were to reconstitute their WMD programs. And the U.S. government wasn't providing that kind of intelligence. I'm an intelligence professional. I've been doing this for a long time. And when I hear the case and heard the case that the Bush administration and the Clinton administration prior to that were making, that Iraq had reconstituted, I wasn't seeing the evidence that gave me absolute certainty. Again, you can't be sure until you get the inspectors on the ground, but what I point out to people is that the inspectors did return, and they found nothing. And they were finding nothing right up to the point that the president ordered the troops across the border. It leads me to believe that we weren't interested in weapons of mass destruction, that this war was never about getting rid of Saddam's WMD. It was about getting rid of Saddam, and we were using the WMD as an excuse to go to war. We didn't want the truth from the inspectors. We wanted to maintain the perception that Saddam was non-compliant. And the last thing we needed were a bunch of inspectors on the ground contradicting the intelligence, the so-called intelligence put forward by the U.S. government.
Scott, we don't have a lot of time, but I definitely want to ask you a couple more questions about this. We're talking to Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector. So when you saw the administration, well, let me put it this way. How did they do it? How did they get the CIA and other intelligence organizations within the government to play ball enough that there could be enough vagueness where they say, yeah, they got WMD?
Well, one of the problems is that our intelligence services have become absolutely politicized, so that it's not about telling your boss what the facts are. It's about telling your boss what he or she wants to hear. At the low level of analysis, yes, the CIA analysts and other intelligence analysts put out dissenting points of view. We now know that today, that there were people out there saying, hey, this dog don't hunt, this thing don't smell right. But once it works its way up to the middle management wants to keep senior management happy, and the only way senior management can be happy is if the executive powers are happy. That is, if you're providing them with the intelligence information that reinforces the position that they're politically trying to sell. And so the CIA's job became more rubber stamping a case that had already been made about Saddam rather than making its own case. You only have to look at the performance of CIA Director George Tenet to see what I'm talking about. You only have to look at the performance of Colin Powell when he made a presentation before the Security Council in February of 2003 to see what I'm talking about. They didn't present all the intelligence. They cherry-picked the intelligence information that backed up the case that the Bush administration was trying to sell. It is the corruption of the entire intelligence community and the entire intelligence system. And sadly, the reforms after September 11th haven't changed any of this. We need to depoliticize our intelligence community so that the facts are being put on the table, not the fiction.
So they did this on purpose. They sent the orders from up above to say, hey, listen, we would be pleased if you found this type of evidence. So that leads to the ultimate question of why. Why did they do this? If they weren't really concerned about the WMD and the threat to the U.S., what was Dick Cheney concerned about?
Dick Cheney and others were about implementing a national security strategy that has the United States imposing its will on the Middle East and on other areas around the world. It dates back to Dick Cheney's 1992 defense review in the aftermath of the fall of the Soviet Union. A decision had to be made. Do we work with the rest of the world to multilaterally fill the vacuum created by the Soviet Union's collapse, or do we step in unilaterally? And the decision was made to step in unilaterally. Now, 8 years of Clinton administration intervened, but when the Bush administration came back into play, they wanted to move forward on this vision on how America would interact with the world. September 11th gave them the opportunity. The global war of terror gave them the vehicle to operate from. And in September 2002, they passed the National Security Strategy of the United States of America that spoke of regional transformation in the Middle East. They needed a trigger point, though, and that trigger point was Iraq. Iraq had already been sold to the American people as a case worthy of war. Over a decade of demonization had made it easy to go to war with Iraq, and that's why we chose Iraq. Now, Paul Wolfowitz stated in a Vanity Fair interview in December 2003 that the reason why they picked WMD is that was the easiest case to make to the American people about going to war with Iraq. But it was never about WMD, and it really wasn't necessarily about getting rid of Saddam Hussein. They used the demonization of Saddam Hussein as a means to trigger a war with Iraq that was supposed to set in play a regional transformation of the entire Middle East, inclusive of Iraq, Syria, Iran. We see today that hasn't succeeded, but that's what they wanted when they went to war in 2003.
Were those political decisions that you think happen in the normal course of an administration, and you know, every administration tries to use PR on the American people in one way or another, and they use it in this case to push for war? Or do you think Cheney did something so egregious that we should consider charges against him?
No, remember, this didn't happen in a vacuum. In the summer of 2002, Dick Lugar, a Republican senator from Indiana, and Joe Biden, a Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, who's now the Democratic vice presidential candidate, convened hearings for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that were pretty much a kangaroo court designed to rubber stamp the Bush administration's case for war. So there's a lot of complicity here. This isn't just about Dick Cheney running some sort of secret government to undermine democracy in America. This is about the executive branch and the legislative branch moving forward on a policy option of global domination. It's the Senate that passed resolutions saying that we are just in going into Iraq, that regime change is a justified policy, etc. Yes, we blame the executive. As Harry Truman said, the buck stops here. And yes, Dick Cheney has had unprecedented levels of access and power, more power than a vice president has ever had. But at the end of the day, this is a problem of American government, and indeed of how America as a whole sees its role in the world. We were a people willingly led down the path of war. It's not as though there had to be great amounts of deception taking place.
Well, Scott, I got to do a follow-up on that then. Do you think that Lugar and Biden and the rest of the senators also believed in American global domination, and they knew that the game that was being played on the American public? Or did they feel, politically, I can't fight this because the administration is too powerful after 9/11 with their popularity, so I'm just going to go along? Or did they actually believe some of this nonsense about WMDs in Iraq?
Well, I think it's a combination of both. First of all, Lugar and Biden were in a position to believe with absolute certainty anything. Anytime they have to make a judgment on WMD, it's going to require them to assume that the information that they are being given access to is accurate. I think they wanted to believe the information about WMD. I think they believe they're both very interventionist in their outlook, but I also do believe that there's an element of fait accompli, that after September 11th, the senators, like members of Congress, like representatives, believe that the president was in far too strong a position. Remember, John Kerry also participated in this, and he's somebody who had his eye on, running for president in 2004. Hillary Clinton, likewise, was somebody who participated, and she had higher political ambitions. I think most people realized that the case for war against Iraq had already been made to the American public. The American public had been pre-programmed to accept at face value anything negative about Saddam Hussein, and so it was not a politically wise move to be seen as opposing the president in this time. And remember, the summer of 2002 was less than 1 year after the horrific attacks of September 11th, and so there weren't too many people that had the political courage to stand up and oppose the president. So I do believe that it's a combination of two. Both of these men and many others in the Senate were predisposed towards accepting a very interventionist policy by the United States, but neither one of them wanted to be in a position where they were accused of being unpatriotic and preventing the president from doing what he needed to do to protect America after the events of September 11th.
All right, former UN weapons inspector Scott Ritter, who, by the way, will be at the Kernville Freedom Festival this Saturday, October 25th. Thank you so much for joining us, Scott. We really, really appreciate it.